All right, well, thank you very much. My name is Jason Dare, and I'm with Fluid Color, and I do R&D work here at the company. I've been in the printing industry for about 25 years, done pre-press, worked at digital printers, flexo printers, SHEETFED shops, all different types of stuff. I'm a G7 expert and do color management training also. So today we're going to talk about how thinking like a manufacturer leads to great color. So, and it's all about the path, as you will see. It's all about the path. So all printing is a customized manufacturing process. I'm sure everybody can agree. Generally, when I make this statement, nobody puts up a hand and says, no, it's not, it's not. I mean, that's all it is. It's just a customized manufacturing process. But what's weird about printing is, in the printing industry, is that printing companies generally don't think like manufacturing companies. When you look at a printing company, you'll notice that they focus heavily on results, getting the job and getting it out the door and getting paid. You know, and why not? Because results are important. That's what pays the bills. You get the job out the door, you're going to get paid. But if you look at a manufacturing company, they realize that yes, the results are important, but what's equally as important is the path I take to reach the result. You know, manufacturing companies, you know, they have people that handle the daily production and they have people that manage those people. But manufacturing companies also have people that manage all of their processes. And these people have in-depth knowledge of the equipment and the software that they have in order to use it to construct the most efficient process possible. So what we're going to talk about are manufacturing processes. So if you look at a manufacturing company, it kind of breaks down into two main components. The first component would be the production component. And you see this at every printing company in America. And it revolves around getting the job, planning it, ordering your raw materials, producing it in a timely manner, shipping it, and billing it. And I've not seen a printing company on God's green earth that's not 1,000% committed to the production component. They'll have managers in multiple departments to ensure that jobs are moving through production as quickly as possible. But if you look at like the other side, which is the process side or your path, you know, which revolves around being efficient, being consistent, getting predictable results, having procedures, and using process controls. In your shop, who manages your processes? Whose job is it to make sure that everything that I'm doing on the printer is as efficient and consistent and predictable as possible? Now, if you look inside of a printing company, there are many processes. There's lots of processes, from order management and all of that software, your MIS systems and all of those things. They all have tons of features in order to get in orders into the system and out as quickly as possible. Pre-flighting, you know, lots of shops I go to, they don't even pre-flight, they just print stuff. But pre-flighting, making sure that the file, you know, and all the components and all the specifications are met before it goes into production. Your appearance or your color workflow, which is what we're going to talk about today. Your content workflow, to make sure that when the files come in, that they're not compromised and the content in the file is not compromised, or the fonts and all of that content is preserved all the way through the workflow. By not taking PDF files and opening them up in Illustrator, that can jeopardize your content. Proofing, whether it be soft proofing or hard proofing, and how you're going to handle that. Your imposition, lots of choices there, lots of software packages for imposition, like automation with imposition, your process controls on your devices, all of your separate finishing processes, your mailing process, shipping, your employee training. You know, a lot of shops have a lot of turnover. Do you have detailed training checklists for your equipment, for your software, so that if one person leaves, you already have a program in place to train the next employee? And R&D, which is a big thing, is like looking for what can we do to be better? What software package can make us more efficient? Where can we tweak this? All of those types of things. Because in today's very competitive landscape, managing your processes is going to be critical to your margins. And I've seen, personally, I've been to lots of printing companies, and I've seen lots of time and money that's been easily wasted by having ineffective processes. So for example, I went to a customer several years ago to do some training, and they did work for a large internet company. This internet company would provide to them print-ready PDFs every day with a cut line. I was at the customer and I watched the manager of the department. They were using the Onyx RIP. She had the list of files that she had, and she would open each one up in Onyx. She would open up the file. Onyx rips the file. She would open it up in Job Ticket Editor. She would change her resolution. She would set her media preset, her resolution. They would turn on the cut line. They would select the cutter, and they would hit submit, and it would rip again. And they would open up the next file. And I asked, I said, how many files do you get a day? And they said, well, we get, sometimes as few as 50, sometimes as many as 150. I said, how long does it take you to do this? And she said, sometimes a couple hours, sometimes like 5 hours. I said, do they all get roughly the same settings? Yeah, they get the same settings. I said, do you know what a quick set is in Onyx? No, never. No, I've never heard of a quick set. Well, it's a little automated workflow in Onyx where you can create a hot folder and you can assign different attributes to that hot folder. Let's make one. So in 2 minutes, I made a quick set in Onyx. I set it for the settings that they were choosing. It makes the hot folder. I take our 100 PDF files, I dump them into the hot folder, and they go off to the printer. I said, I've just cleaned up your day. So in a matter of 2 minutes, we saved them 5 hours a day on most days. And I see things like this when I go to printing companies all the time. But these things get down to the processes. And all of those processes about bringing it in, they didn't have in-depth knowledge of the software, and there were features in there that would save them a massive amount of time. So what we're going to talk today about is our color workflow process. We're going to choose one, and this is what we're going to stick with. So we're just going to talk about the color workflow. It's going to be about printing efficiently, printing consistently, printing predictably, having procedures, and using process controls. So the first thing is how do I create a color workflow? So I want to create a color workflow. I want to get my stuff under control. Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to have a good understanding of what a color workflow is and how color moves through from the time that the work is done by the designer to what happens in pre-press to what happens at the RIP and what happens at the printer. The next thing is you need to evaluate your device. If you want a device to print consistently, it needs to be working mechanically correct. Your print head alignments, all of those types of things have to be good, because if you need to print consistently, it's got to be operating correctly. Make sure all your nozzles fire, all of those things. The next thing is you need to make a conscious decision about how you wish to print. Do you want to print to a specification such as G7, which is really good because it's just, I'm printing a neutral gray. But once you define how you wish to print, you need to calibrate and profile and set up your workflow so that you produce that definition. And then lastly, and most importantly, is you need to manage the entire process. You have to have process controls, and you need to have standard operating procedures, because, evaluating your devices and building presets and all that stuff, it's no good unless they get managed with process controls over time. So what do I need to create this color workflow? Well, you're going to need instrumentation. You're going to need a spectrophotometer. I've seen people buy $200,000 printers and balk at paying $1,600 for a spectrophotometer. It's, you just can't make wine on a beer budget. So, if you're worried about color and you need consistency and you're tired of playing the guessing game, then yes, you do need a spectrophotometer. You're going to need software. Now, luckily, most of the RIP manufacturers have software included in their RIP. Caldera has Easy Media, and Onyx has their Media Manager, and it allows you to calibrate and profile your printers. X-Rite has software, and then if you were even playing the G7 game, the Curve 4 software. Next, you need knowledge. You can get knowledge by doing seminars such as this, or going to trade shows, or getting G7 training, or using a consultant, or going to online resources for online training from the ID Alliance and other places, and books. But there's a lot of ways to gain the knowledge. And then lastly, you need the skill. You need to have somebody with the skill level that can take the knowledge, take the software, use your instrumentation, and do something with it. So why should I create a color workflow? Well, number one, efficiency. If you set it up properly, you should achieve the biggest color gamut possible with the least amount of ink, which is huge. You can get consistency from device to device, day to day, and month to month. You can get predictability. No more printing and praying. You should have a pretty good idea of what the job's going to look like before it comes off the printer. And then lastly is confidence. You will own your workflow. You will know every detail of your workflow, and you can defend your printing. You can defend what you do. So, moving on, the next one that we're going to talk about is, why do we use ICC profiles? And ICC profiles get talked about every day in this industry, and we're going to dive in. I'm going to try to give you a different way to think about them. So the first thing is what is an ICC profile? So ICC stands for International Color Consortium. It's a standard file extension, and basically it's a digital file that records the color gamut information of a device. So when I think about color and I talk about color and whatnot, color is really a three-dimensional object. So if you take an ICC profile, you can map it out three-dimensionally. So I have some examples of different shapes and sizes of ICC profiles, from Grackle, which would be a sheet-fed press, to sRGB, an ICC profile off of our Ricoh flatbed printer, and then one off of a solvent printer. So whenever I think about color and color management and all of that, I'm seeing three-dimensional objects in my mind. So I generally will say like a sheet-fed printing press would be the size of a baseball, and a UV-CURABLE printer would be a softball, and a solvent printer or a latex printer would be a cantaloupe, and an RGB would be a basketball. And then the biggest one of all would be lab, which is a numerical value for any color a person with normal vision can see. Lab would be a very large beach ball. So a lot about color management is what happens when I go from a baseball to a basketball? What happens when I go from a cantaloupe to a softball? Those types of things. So the question is, why do we use ICC profiles? So when I do this training, I ask this question, and I generally get two different answers. The most common answer I get will be, it provides color consistency. And my response is, that's the result of using ICC profiles, but not the root reason. The other answer I get is none at all. I just get a blank stare. So the reason why we use ICC profiles on digital devices is because all the printers are using different colors of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink. It's that simple. And even the ones that use the same color of ink don't jet the same color because of print heads and droplet sizes and ink temperatures. So if you had 5 printers and we didn't use ICC profiles and you wanted to make them all print the same, you'd have to manually color correct every job for every device. And that would stink. So let's look at a sheet-fed press workflow. All right. So this is your typical workflow on a sheet-fed offset press. And sheet-fed offset printing from a color standpoint works accidentally on purpose. It's the craziest thing ever. But you impose and you trap the file. You apply a curve. Usually it's a bump curve of some sort. You'll image plates, you'll put it on the press, and voila, you magically get a pretty good result. The reason is most of the inks that we use on presses is based on an ISO standard called ISO 12647. And most people print the same ink film thickness. So as a result, they're generally printing the same color. All right. So it works because most of the presses are running pretty close to the same ink set. But if you took the same workflow that is used for a sheet-fed press and you use it on a digital device, the results are different. You impose the file, you apply a curve, you put it on the printer, and the result doesn't look good because the ink set's different. That image was separated by default for that ink set that's in that printing press. This ink set in this digital printer is different. So that's why the colors look different. So what do? You know, option 1 would be, why didn't they just use the same color of CMYK inks in all the printers? Well, if they could, they would have, but for a multitude of reasons, they couldn't. And on digital devices, they were able to push the pigment loads and whatnot, even achieve a bigger color gamut than a digital, than your typical sheet-fed press. But what happens if there was a way that we could automatically adjust the images using ICC profiles and color management? That would be the way to go. So what will happen with a digital device you use an ICC profile is the software is going to automatically color correct it for you. All you need is an ICC profile that accurately describes how your printer currently prints. If you have that, the color management engine will automatically color correct your job for you. If the ICC profile that you're using does not accurately represent how your printer currently prints, then the color correction is wrong and you don't get the color you want. So quite simply, in digital printing, why do most people not get the color that they desire? Because the ICC profile that they're using does not accurately describe how their printer currently prints, and the color correction is wrong. So how important is it to have accurate ICC profiles? It's everything. If you want to accurately produce color, you need accurate ICC profiles. So let's talk a little bit about color management. We'll try to tie some of this stuff together. And these first few slides here are just going to be a little bit, you know, as far as knowledge, just to make sure that we're all talking the same language. So describing color. So a big thing about this is CMYK values alone do not describe a specific color. So if I had a file that had 100% magenta and 80% yellow and I sent it to 5 different printers, I'm going to get 5 different results because those 5 different printers are probably using different colors of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink. All right. Now, if I take my file or my image that has those values and I attach an ICC profile to it, I now have a specific definition of color right down to the lab value. So in color management, it is important, it is vitally important that your images and your documents have ICC profiles attached to them, because that's what gives you a true color definition. Now we have a few other terms that you'll hear out there. You hear the term color model, which basically means are we in RGB or CMYK? And we'll also hear the term color space, okay? And this is kind of a way to group different ICC profiles. You have working spaces and you have device space ICC profiles. A device space ICC profile is built on a specific device. I had a printer, I built an ICC profile on it. This is it. It describes how this printer prints, or this monitor, or this scanner, or this camera. Working space ICC profiles are either theoretical, made by color scientists, or made by averaging large groups of printers together. So sRGB, which is based on a 1990s Windows monitor, and then Adobe RGB was meant to be a little bit better than sRGB, you know, they fall in that theoretical realm. Also ProPhoto RGB. Swap and Grackle were made by averaging lots of presses together. But working spaces have been nice and smoothed out, and everything is nice and uniform. So they work really good for image creation and image editing and Photoshop work and all of that, because when you make color movements, it moves as you expect. Everything is nice and smooth and uniform. A device space, we just use that in our color management conversion, and we don't want to do any kind of editing or any kind of file creation in those, because printers are never linear, they're never perfectly smooth, they always got things, and it wouldn't be a good space to do any kind of imaging editing in, because you know things are going to move unexpectedly. So these working spaces and these device spaces play into this. A lot of the confusion when it comes to ICC profiles and color management is simply they get used two different ways. And the first way is they get used as what's called a working color space, or in a RIP, it would be called the input ICC profile. And in that role, all they do is give a color definition to an image, a vector graphic, or any type of digital file. They give you a color definition. If we're working in Photoshop and we have sRGB as our working color space, we now see how that image appears in that working space. You know, when we go to the RIP and, you know, it assigns, you know, Grackle as our input profile, that's what sets the color definition. But ICC profiles in a RIP, in what we call the output profile, which is the final part of the color management conversion, when they're used as an output profile, they actually define the final CMYK or device values that are going to go to the printer after the color management conversion. Your ICC profile is going to determine how much black's in there and how everything is going to go to the printer in order to achieve the color that you desire. What's big about the differences between digital and analog is, you know, when we were in analog world, you know, we focused on numbers because everybody was running basically the same colors of ink. So numbers were important. You know, I need a red, it's going to be 94, you know, 50, you know, that's my red. I give those numbers to 5 printers and I think I'm going to get the same red. In a digital workflow, we don't care about the numbers. We care about the color. We care about defining the color and then using whatever numbers are necessary on any of the printers to produce the color that we want. It's a backwards way to think. It's different. And it does cause a lot of confusion in the industry because a lot of people come from the analog side. We all came from the analog side, and you're used to thinking about numbers, 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 numbers. Now you come to the digital side, we don't really care about numbers. We care about a color definition, a lab value, letting the color management engine doing its work and giving us whatever set of values that we need to produce that color. So let's talk a little bit about what happens at the printer. So another thing that causes a little bit of confusion are these things in the industry, and they go by lots of different names, and that causes a lot of the confusion. You hear the term profile, media profile, color profile, substrate preset, media preset, ICC profile. You hear all of these different terms. And what we're talking about is a proprietary file format that contains all of the information that a printer and a RIP needs to print, okay? So the proper name, what I believe is the proper name, would be a media preset, okay? And a media preset always contains three things. The first thing it contains is your printer settings. So whatever settings is available to your printer: resolution, passes or print mode, curing temperature, tension, vacuum, anything that's available in the printer that the RIP can control, you know, all of those printer settings. The second thing that the preset contains is your calibration files, your individual ink restrictions. How much cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink am I putting down? My transitions, if I'm using light colors, you know, how do I use the light cyan and the light magenta? My linearization to make sure that I'm smooth from 100 to 0. And then lastly, my total ink limit. So essentially, if I sent a file that had 100% of each color, where's it going to cut it off at? And thirdly, the media preset contains an ICC profile that you created that accurately describes how your printer prints with those calibrations, with those specific printer settings, on the media you have loaded on your printer. All of that together is a media preset. Now, how do you create a media preset? As we kind of talked about earlier, all the RIPs anymore have a wizard, you know, quite simply, print, measure, repeat, you know, with a spectrophotometer. You can get way off in the weeds if you want to, but on all the RIP manufacturers, using the default settings can give you more than a good result. Because going through the process and building and having your own ICC profile is always going to be better than using something that was generic. So the first thing is you evaluate your device, you make sure it works mechanically correct, all your nozzles are firing, all your print heads are in alignment. You do your calibration, ink restrictions, transitions, linearizations. And then thirdly, you will print out a characterization chart, which is that big chart of all those colors. You'll measure it with the spectrophotometer, and the engine inside the RIP will build the ICC profile. Now, when you look at media presets, we have three types of media presets. They fall into three basic categories. The first is a custom media preset. That's always the preferred method. That's when you build it with your spectrophotometer on your media and your printer. That's always the preferred way to do it. The other type is what we refer to as a canned preset. And those are generally provided by printer, media, or RIP manufacturers. And the thing about canned presets is they can be kind of unpredictable. You don't know who made them. You don't know what their skill level was. You know, I've personally made canned presets, and you have to be very conservative with all the ink settings because you never know the environment that it's going to go in, whether it's going to be high altitude or low altitude or high humidity or low humidity. So if you're making one that's going to be canned, you have to be kind of conservative with all your ink settings because you don't want to cause problems when it goes out in the field. And then the last is a substitute preset. And this you see a lot on solvent and aqueous and latex printers. And it basically falls into this, you know, I've got a roll of Ultra Flex, Jet Flex vinyl, and there is no media preset available for Ultra Flex, Jet Flex. But I know if I tell it I'm running Ultra Flex Ultima, then there is a preset for that and it works okay. So on a lot of printers, the first time that you run something, you have to determine what type of media preset you're going to use. These are the only three choices. You're either going to make a custom one, you're going to find a canned one, or through trial and error, you're going to figure out a substitute. But those are the only three choices. Now, when we talk about media presets and we talk about media presets and UV-CURABLE inkjet printers. Now, UV-CURABLE inkjet printers have advantages over aqueous and solvent and latex printers. And it's because the ink cures almost instantaneously. It cures as soon as it goes down. So with UV-CURABLE inkjet printers, we don't get a lot of interaction between the ink and the media that we see on aqueous and solvent and latex. And because things get cured as soon as they go down, we generally can get by with less media presets. On aqueous or solvent, because all the medias have different characteristics, you're going to have presets for different medias at different resolutions and different passes, because they all kind of interact, you know, all differently. But on a UV curable inkjet, you can generally get by with fewer because we don't have that interaction and the ink just lays on top of the media. You know, I usually get people will say, well, you know, like the white points and things are different. Well, yes, you know, if you made one on blue paper and you made a preset on yellow paper, can you kind of get the lighter areas to clean up a little bit? Yes, you can, but you still can't overcome the basic fact that if something's on blue paper and something's on yellow paper, it's never going to look exactly the same in the lighter areas where the media shines through. But by using the same preset in your more saturated areas where you will cover up the media, you'll notice that the colors are exactly the same because the ink covers up the media and it doesn't shine through. So by having less media presets on a UV curable printer, you can get more consistent color because the more you make, you inevitably will pick up measurement errors and things like that where things will be a little bit off. But if you can get by with a few of them, as you can on a UV curable printer, you'll see more color consistency. So the printers that we do here when we set up in manufacturing, to my knowledge, we're the only manufacturer that really does this, but we do take the time and build custom presets on the printers. We do 3 in the 3 basic resolutions. We do them. We find one that it helps us in our quality control because we're really analyzing and looking how the printer's printing and making sure that everything's good. And then we also feel that, you know, for new operators and whatnot, it helps them to get started right out of the gate. So, you know, this whole conversation is really, you know, trying to get you to think more like a manufacturer and look at all the things going on in the company and, you know, seeing them as processes that actually have to be managed, you know. So when you talk about a color workflow, you know, in order for it to be successful inside your operation, somebody has to own it. It has to be somebody's job to own the workflow, you know. Getting it set up is going to take a little bit more time. You know, you may need some assistance, you may need a consultant to help you or whatnot. But once it gets set up and you have your procedures and you have your process controls, it's going to be easier to manage. And, you know, like we said earlier, the key is, you know, you got to have those process controls. You got to do, you know, things to make sure. And if you look at your different options of process controls, you know, I mean, it can be as simply as just eyeballing it. Just having something, a color chart or something that you print every day, put some gray balance bars in there and just visually compare it. If you can do that, that is huge, you know. But you could go to the next stage and you can use a spectrophotometer. You know, if you've got an X-Rite Exact or whatever, and you can measure and you can make sure that, you know, your primary colors are the same every day. Or you can move on and even get more fancy and analyze it. Both Onyx and Caldera have software in there that allows you to do process control checks. It'll measure it and it'll gauge and store the data and show you how you fluctuate on a day-to-day basis. And then lastly, there are cloud options out there that are much more sophisticated that allows you to measure, store the data up in the cloud, look at timelines and see how things move over time and allow you to do iterations and all different kinds of things. So you can get very, very, you know, robust in your process control options, or you can just eyeball it, you know. I mean, you know, it doesn't do anything extra just to at least eyeball it, and that's big. So in the end, you know, this all comes down to defending your printing, you know. That was one of the things, that was one of the reasons why to do all this and to defend your printing. So I'll leave you with this. So if a customer came to you and he had you print a CMYK image and you printed that image and he then told you that it was incorrect, what would you say? A lot of companies would say, well, I'm sorry, you know, if you give us a proof, we'll print it, or, you know, we'll redo it or whatever, tell us what you would do. Well, whenever I was in production, that's not what I said. I told the customer that I have properly calibrated and profiled my printer. I have an ICC profile that accurately describes how my printer prints. I took the image that you gave me, I identified the ICC profile that you embedded in your image, and I ensured that it got honored by my RIP. I can state with 100% certainty that I have accurately produced your image as you gave it to me. If you do not like it, that's fine. We can color correct it for you. You may or may not be charged. So as you can see, we talk about color, but when you talk about the components of a color workflow, it's basically black and white, you know? It's just a process, you know, there's no magic going on. It's just about identifying, you know, it's about setting up your printer correctly, identifying your color, and let it move through. So I thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed. We can now do a little bit of Q&A. I can look here and see if we had any questions.
Looks like right now we have one, and I encourage everybody to kind of send in your questions if you have any. Right now I see, why do ink manufacturers use different CMYKs instead of standardizing?
Okay, so ink manufacturers for digital printers, okay? So on a, on the SHEETFED side, they generally use, like we said, an ISO standard, which is a lot of people use. But on the digital side, the manufacture and the creation of digital inks is very complicated because there are lots of give and takes, you know, and there are lots of different applications, do I want to be better on flexible? Well, then if I want to be better on flexible, I'm not as good on rigid. Do I want to have a bigger color gamut, but maybe I'll lose a little bit on ink adhesion? So there are all these trade-offs going on whenever people go to make inks. And a lot of times they can make ink sets that have bigger color gamuts than what you find on sheet-fed presses or like analog devices. So because of that, that's why all of these manufacturers, you know, the ink sets that they use are not all the same. You know, there's just a multitude of reasons.
Sounds good. That's actually a question that I had before. We have another one. If you don't have a spectrophotometer, I probably mispronounced that, is there a way to still get consistent color?
If you don't have a spectrophotometer,
is there a way to still get consistent color?
Well, your only hope would be to use the default settings or the default setup that came with the printer, all right? And you could establish some sort of process control, okay? So you could visually check it from day one and see. But if that printer moves, you don't have any way of getting it back to where it was. And all printers will move over time. They don't always print consistency on a day-to-day basis for a multitude of reasons. So your printer's going to move. So if you don't have a spectrophotometer, you're going to be always using a moving target.
All right. We have another one. Just read it. Is black dye sublimation different from different manufacturers or between different manufacturers?
Yeah, it's also a digital ink, so none of them are using, you know, always use the same pigments and whatnot. So there is a lot of difference. And then the other question was about color hues. And so hue is the actual color. So if you imagine like a clock on the wall and you see the numbers, you know, 12, 1, 2, 3. Hue is your color. So 12 o'clock would be yellow, and 3 o'clock would be orange, and then red, and then green. So around the clock, those are all of your hues, okay? But if you start at the middle of the clock and you move outwards, that's your chroma, or your saturation of color. So the further out you get, the more chroma, the more saturation that you have, okay? Now the crazy thing about color is the human eye is more susceptible to small differences in hue, the actual color, than it is to small differences in your chroma or your saturation. So if you have a printer that can print like 2 different speeds, like 2 different resolutions, like, you know, with our printer, if I run something in 1200 and then I run something in 600, both of them have been properly calibrated and profiled. We produce the same gray balance. As a result, all of our hues are going to be the same, because the gray is the center of the color space. If you're trying to make 5 printers print the same, you're going to get them all print the same gray. Okay, gray is the center of the color space. But the difference between the one that printed with 1200 DPI and the one that printed 600 DPI is your chroma, or your saturation of color. Now, if I put them 2 prints side by side on the wall, the one printed with less ink. It didn't have, you know, we printed faster, it used less ink, we don't have the same chroma, and you can put them side by side and you can say, yep, that one is just not as bright as the one on the right. But if you take them 2 prints and you put them on opposite walls and then look at them, because your eye is more concerned with the hue than it is over the chroma or the saturation, it's not quite as evident. And that's a big thing with printing. That's why when you get into gray balance and like setting up your printers properly and having good gray balance and getting everything to produce the same hue, that's critical. Your printers are all going to have different chromas or saturations. And if you have one that prints a really bright red, you don't want to dumb it down to the least common denominator. So that's just a little thing that you see whenever you're dealing with color and hues and whatnot. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. Oh, here we go. We have another one. How often should you try and get your printer back to the way it was printing when installed? And is there a way to do that without a spec?
Well, you should. Yeah, process controls is going to be a daily thing. So when I was in production, I had a baseline file that I ran when I got the printer up and running each morning, and I ran that file. I would use a old X-Rite Exact. I would measure like my primary colors and my secondary colors to make sure everything was in good. Okay, this is where I need to be. And then throughout the day, because that file that I used was small, if I was going to do a long run or something, I'd just throw that in. So that job, you know, if I'm running a roll-fed printer, I would just add that little thing on there to what I was printing so that throughout the day, I could see a visual on it. But it is something that, you know, you need to do every day. If the printer was in an unknown state, there's no way to get it back to where it was. So if you didn't record where it was with process controls and it moves, then there's no way to get it back. You know, it's the, you know, I had, the question was posed to me this morning in the shop, was a customer had an, you know, this inkjet printer. Well, they bought a new printer. All right. Well, they thought that they could magically calibrate the new printer to print like the old printer, and it doesn't really work that way. If the old printer was properly calibrated and had a good ICC profile, then you do the same thing to the new printer and they're going to look the same. But if the old printer had an ICC profile that did not accurately represent how it printed, and it printed in an unknown state, you've got no way to get there. You know, you've got no way. You know, there's no magic thing. In that case, you have to just draw the line in the sand and say, you know, we have a new printer. It's properly calibrated and profiled. We're producing neutral grays. Our stuff looks really good. We're drawing a line in the sand. We're getting better every day. And today we print better than we printed yesterday, and we're moving on. And if you need to get back to one of them other jobs, you're probably going to have to color correct it.
All right, sounds good. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I think we're good for today. Again, thank you so much, Jason, for taking some time and just speaking on behalf of this. Thank you, everybody else who was able to come by and just spend a little time and learn with us today. But again, thank you so much. And if you have any questions for Jason, you can see his information here, but also feel free to give us a shout out at info@digitalcolorinc.com. We'd be more than happy to help you out with any questions that you might have. With that, thank you so much, Jason.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day, everybody.